James chapter 1, verse 1. James, a slave of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in dispersion, greetings. Trials and maturity. Consider it great joy, my brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. But endurance must do its complete work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. We can use for a thought this morning evidence. A few weeks back, we came from this same chapter when we talked about unwavering faith, but our focus wasn't on these first three verses. We focused on verses, I think, 6 through 12. We talked about unwavering faith and wisdom and stuff like that. But so many, so often my sermons come from the places that I am at the moment. So I want to talk about the trials this morning. It's a familiar scripture for us. We're familiar with what James has said about our trials and our tribulations and whatnot. Um, as we were just talking here a little while ago, I'm um I'm a big fan of shows like CSI and things that deal with crime scenes and true crime. I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts and stuff, and one of the things that if you watch these shows and whatnot, you hear them talk about evidence a lot, and specifically, they'll talk about hard evidence when they're trying to bring somebody to justice. A lot of the podcasts and stuff I listen to, I hear them talk about hard evidence during these investigations, and hard evidence is defined as evidence that is definitely true. It does not need to be questioned. It's concrete. It's solid. It's just what's needed to prove something. And so often the hard evidence is hard to come by in investigations. It often takes work to find, but then there are other times where that evidence is right there in the open. It's right in front of people's faces. And it's the same for us. We have hard evidence as to who God is to us. So I've got evidence. I've got evidence as to what and who God is to me. And I can testify this morning that so much of my evidence, it has been hard to come by. No, I didn't have to search for this evidence. What I mean when I say it was hard to come by, it was obviously there, but I had to go through some things in order that I might obtain this evidence. So, in other words, I wouldn't know that God is a healer if I hadn't seen him heal. I wouldn't know that he would show up in the nick of time if it hadn't been a situation in which time was running out. I wouldn't know that he was a way maker if I hadn't seen him make a way. I wouldn't know that he will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are stayed on him if I hadn't experienced a lack of peace in my life and had to turn to him. Paul told the Philippians that he knew how to have a little and he knew how to have a lot. But whatever state he found himself in, he had learned to be content. And that suggests to me that he didn't always know how to be content, but he had learned to be content by getting evidence. And this is, I believe, what it's all about as we try to navigate our way through this thing called life. And as we face these trials and tribulations that come up in our life, is what do we do with the evidence that we obtain about who God is. What do we do with it? And what do our trials and our tribulations, what do they mean for us? So James opens this letter in first by identifying himself as a slave or a servant of God, and he addresses it to the 12 tribes who dispersed. The 12 tribes who had left out of Jerusalem, who were in various places. He addresses it to them. And what he says to them is that they need to consider it a great joy. My brothers, whenever you experience various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, but endurance must do its complete work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. So as we build the bridge between the readers of James' letter and ourselves today, I wanted to break this down somewhat, and in some aspects, we will be considering individual words or phrases. And the first thing I want to examine is the first thing that James says in verse 2. He says, consider. Consider. Consider, it means to reflect, to think carefully about something, especially as it relates to making a decision. In this case, it is to think about the trials of life and make a decision on how you will take that trial, how you will handle that trial, how you're going to label that trial. It's again, as I preached a few Sundays back, this is all about choices. And choices are tough. I'm not here this morning to tell you that the choices that we make in life are going to be easy. They're not going to be easy. The choices we're going to make are tough. Sometimes it takes us to the very brink. Sometimes it pushes us to our fullest limits. And one thing that the choices and stuff that we have to make, it will teach us how dependent we are upon God, how much we need him, because it's going to be hard. So James says that we need to consider. So it's not just that we go through a trial, but when we go through the trial, we need to take some time out to ponder some things, to think about the trial that we're going through, to analyze it and to determine, what does this trial mean for my life? How am I going to approach this trial? How am I going to label this trial? And the second thing that I want to examine relates to that, because James says not just to consider, but James says to consider it a great joy. He doesn't just want us to consider our trials, but he wants to consider our trials a great joy. This is the conclusion that I believe James is teaching that we need to come to when dealing with our trials, to place it in a category of joy. Don't just consider the trial, but consider your trial a great joy. Place your trial, what you're facing, in the category of joy. It doesn't even seem like it makes sense, do it? It doesn't seem like it makes sense that I'm going to take the trials and tribulations of my life and I'm going to label this situation as being joyful. Something that's hurting me, something that's keeping me up at night, something that's worrying me, something that I'm fighting through. And James says, consider it joy. And if we were to be honest with ourselves this morning and speak from the humanity of ourselves, one would have to ask, what's wrong with James? They don't even sound normal. What's wrong with James? James, what is James talking about? That he wants me to consider it a great joy. But then when we look at it from this standpoint, and we've preached this and taught this here many times before, we often want to equate joy with happiness, and they're not the same thing. You can be happy without having joy, and you can have joy without being happy. They're not the same thing. Remember, happiness is connected to tangible people, places, and things. Those are the things that affect our happiness. Whether I have the things that I want, Whether I'm going to places I want to go, whether I'm doing the things that I want to do, if I'm working on the job that I want to work on, if I'm living in the house that I want to live in, if I'm driving the car that I want to drive, those are things that make us happy. But joy speaks differently to our souls because in joy we find that we can lack all of those things, but still have an inner peace about us. Still have a determination about us that we're trusting God in spite of our circumstances, that we're as the Bible teaches us to lean not to our own understanding, but in all always acknowledge Him, and He would direct our path. You see, those are the things that joy is the thing that we have when we're going through hell on earth, and people are wondering how we're still standing and how we're still making it. It's because joy is in us, and our forefathers and our foremothers, they got that. That's why they wrote the song, "This joy I have, the world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away." Because there's something special about joy. And let's think about the people who wrote these songs. Let's think about the age they were living in when they wrote these songs. We're talking about people coming up and through slavery, up and through Jim Crow, working jobs where they were training people and making less money than the same people, going in the back doors of houses and restaurants, living through the civil rights era, singing these songs, "This joy I have, the world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away," because their joy was not connected to their happiness. It was connected to relationship with God. Because once again, God is not concerned about your happiness. He's concerned about your holiness. Because if He can get you holy, then He can give you joy. And joy is always going to be greater than happiness. Because joy sustains us when we don't have those things that make us happy. Now, I can testify this morning that part of my humanity, I don't know part of your humanity, part of my humanity is I'm not always happy. I'm not. I'm not always happy. I find myself in need of things. I find myself in want of things. I find myself upset about my circumstances and the things that's going on around me. I find myself upset about stuff that's going on in my job. And I find myself upset and disturbed by the things that I have to experience in my flesh that I don't like, that we all have to experience. I'm not always happy. Joy helps me survive the unhappiness. It helps me put in perspective the unhappiness. It helps me push through the unhappiness. So James says, "Consider it a great joy." And then he says, "My brothers." Now, I'm not sure exactly why it was labeled "my brothers." It says he's addressing it to the 12 tribes of Israel. So I'm assuming that he was addressing it to maybe the leaders of those tribes or whatever. But he says, "My brothers." Of course, we can say "my brothers and my sisters." The point I want to make here is that he's talking to Christians. That's what I want you to get here. When James says, "Consider it great joy when you fall in trials and tribulations," he's talking to Christians because he says, "my brothers." He's talking to people that he's in relationship with through Christ. Here's what Dr. Tony Evans says. Dr. Tony Evans says that Christians in crisis are going through an extreme makeover. And this is the point that I believe James is driving home here. He's saying, Christians, your life is not always going to be easy. And that you're in a place to be made over. If a man be in Christ, he is a new creation. Old things are passed away. Behold, all things become new. Paul says that we ought to transform our minds. There's a transformation process that's always taking place within Christians because the moment that we come to Christ, God is about the business of taking us and reshaping us into the people that He wants us to be. So James is saying to Christians, consider it a great joy. He's talking to the church to consider it a great joy when you come against these trials and these tribulations. And the next thing I want to point out to you is that he says, whenever you experience various trials, that tells me that when it comes to trials and tribulations, they're going to come to us in different forms, right? It could be in our health. It could be in the health of a loved one. It could be in our finances. Once again, it could be in our families. It could be on our jobs. Our trials and tribulations are going to come to us in different forms. And one of the things that we wrestle with, if we're to be honest about it, it's the straw that broke the camel's back type of thing, is that we're not just dealing with a trial, we're dealing with trials. And they're coming at us at the same time in all different directions. Or maybe I'm just talking about myself. One thing hits us, then another thing hits us. And while we're trying to deal with this, then this hits us. And before we can even get our mind wrapped around what just happened to us, now we got to deal with this over here. And we got all of these various trials, and they're coming at us. But James says, count it great joy. When I'm dealing with all this different stuff, all of this different heartache, all of this different pain, all of this different stress, I'm supposed to count it joy. I'm supposed to consider it. I'm supposed to compare it. I'm supposed to think about it. And when I consider it and compare it and think about it, I have to take my trials and put them in the category of joy. You mean my sickness? I got to place it in the category of joy. My financial troubles, I got to put it in the category of love, of joy. My loss, I got to put it in the category of joy. All of this heartache and pain, he says, put it in the category of joy, rather than examining it and saying, this is the worst moment of my life. He says, we got to have a resolve to call this situation joyful. We got to have a resolve to call it joyful. And then he tells us why. He says, because of the testing of your faith. The testing of our faith. And the point that I want to say here is just, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words. God causes or God allows. He says the testing of your faith. Notice that James did not say here what the enemy is doing to you. And we know that some of the things we go through are come by the enemy. He says the testing of your faith. So what happens when we're tested? We're issued a pass or a fail grade. And something else that happens before we're tested is if you're going to take a test and you want to pass it, there's usually some preparation for it, right? There's usually some studying for it, right? So what James is saying is that our trials and our tribulations are the material that we need to pass the test. It's the material that we need. My brothers and my sisters, it is easy for us to stand and say, God is good when everything is going okay. But can you still say God is good when your world is crumbling around you? That's where the test comes in at. This is the testing of your faith. It's easy to say, oh, my God is a way maker. But it's different to say when you're depending on him to make a way. It's easy to say that he will keep you in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on him. But it's different to say it when you are on the verge of losing your mind. It's different. So he's talking about the testing of your faith, what we're going through in our obstacles, in our trials, in our tribulations, in our loss, and everything that comes at us. It's a test of our faith. And I'm here to tell you this morning that when it comes to the testing of our faith, when it comes to our trials and our tribulations, God brings them to us, or either God allows them to come to us. He brings them to us, or he allows them to come to us. So then he says, after he talks about the testing of your faith, he says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. It produces endurance. Endurance is building us up. That's the trying of our faith is producing endurance. We've used this example before with athletes who prepare themselves for what they do on the courts or on the fields or wherever they're playing at. They have to build endurance. Or runners who's going to run in a marathon who have to build endurance. They have to go through something to get their body ready for what's going to be next. They go through conditioning. You don't run a marathon until you walk first, and then you jog, and then you run a little bit, and now you're ready for the marathon. You got to prepare your body. And our trials are preparing our spirits and our minds. Because how many of you in this room this morning know that when one trial comes, another one's going to come behind it? What is it they say? We are either in the valley, coming out of the valley, or going back into the valley. It's a roller coaster. And trials are going to keep on coming. And sometimes as our trials come, they increase in magnitude and strength in our life. And each one gets a little bit more difficult. But we're able to take it because the trying of our faith has produced in us an endurance to be able to stand solidly upon the word of God and believe that God is exactly who he said that he is. Endurance. But James says, but your endurance must do its complete work. Your endurance must do its complete work. It's only natural that when we're going through things, that we seek to find ways out of our trials and tribulations. We all do it. We come up against a financial storm. We get our calculators and we start figuring out stuff. And what can I do to get out of this and find my way out of this situation? We come up in problems on our jobs, and we start sending out resumes and stuff. Maybe I need to change jobs. We start figuring out ways to get out of our situation. But what if? What if in the midst of your trial is where you're supposed to be? What if God has you right where he wants you? Because he's trying to produce something in you. That's why God calls us the God allows. Because he's trying to produce something in us. He's trying to grow something in us. And this is what James says. He says, endurance must have its complete work. You got to be in the situation so the endurance can completely come upon you, that there can be a complete change. So he says that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. You see, that's the point that God is trying to get us to. And he gets us there by first telling us to consider it joy when you get into these trials and tribulations. No, it don't make sense that I'm going to put my pain in the category of joy. But when you step through those verses, you see the outcome is that you may be mature and complete and lacking nothing. So what I learned from this, in order for God to get me to the place where I am a mature Christian, where I'm complete and where I'm lacking nothing, I've got to have the trials. I've got to go through the trials. They've got to produce endurance in me. And my spirit and my soul has to agree with God some way, somehow, to consider these things a great joy. Not just joy, a great joy. But God is faithful. And I stopped by here today to let you know that regardless of what you're going through, regardless of what life is throwing at you, regardless of the fact that every time you turn around, something else is happening, don't you leave this place today until you have made up in your mind that God is still good. That's what I want you to understand, that even though you're going through these trials and tribulations, and sometimes you're facing the worst aspect of life, don't you leave this place today until you have made up your mind that God is still good. I stopped by today to tell you that even when it seems the enemy is winning, even in those days when it feels like the bad outweighs the good, even when you feel like your back is up against the wall, when you feel like you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, when the wicked prosper in front of your eyes, when problems abound and the answers are few, and you're wondering, where is God in the midst of your pain? Don't you leave this place today until you realize that God is still sitting on the throne. Yes, he is still in control, and try as much as you can to remember that nothing can touch you unless it's filtered through his hands first. It might sound cliche-ish, but if he brings you to it, he's going to bring you through it. It might sound cliche-ish, but there is a purpose for your pain. It might sound like a cliche, but you're going through it for a reason, and you're going through it for a season. But it's not a cliche, because all things do work together for good to those who are called according to his purpose. Can I encourage you this morning that while you're going through, you've got to work through. You've got to work through your purpose. You see, no matter how high you rise or how low you fall, never forget that you have purpose. I've come to believe that in our darkest hours, our purpose can bring us peace. Let me say that again. In our darkest hours, our purpose can bring us peace. The examples have been set for us. David failed when he committed adultery with Bathsheba, but he worked his purpose. Jesus himself anguished in the Garden of Gethsemane, but he worked his purpose. Paul was shipwrecked, bitten by a viper, struggled with a thorn in the flesh, locked in prison, but he worked his purpose. Esther was reminded over in the Old Testament by Mordecai that she was brought to a place in a time for such a time as this. And the fulfillment of her purpose not only saved her, but it saved her people and brought promotion. You got to work your purpose. While you're dealing with your trials and tribulations, know that you came into this world with purpose. Know that you came into this world with a call upon your life. And while you're going through your trials and your tribulations, you will survive the darkest of your hours if you keep on working your purpose while you're there. Whatever he called you to do. If he called you to preach, preach through your pain. If he called you to sing, sing through your pain. If he called you to teach, teach through your pain. If he called you and gave you the gift of gifts, give through your pain. Whatever you do, use your purpose to give you strength to stand. Because he gave you your purpose for a reason. And I am of the school of thought to believe that he would do exactly what he said. He who has begun a good work in you will complete it until that day. And we can survive this, y'all. We can make it through this. We can survive the pain. We can make it through the heartache. We can get over the bad days. But you see, what the enemy wants you to do is to focus on your problems so much that you stop focusing on your purpose. He doesn't want you to do what God asked you to do. So he makes you focus on the bad things. He makes you focus on the heartache. He makes you focus on the pain, because if he gets you there, then maybe somebody won't hear that sermon. Maybe somebody won't hear that song. Maybe somebody won't be impacted by that praise. Maybe somebody won't have that shoulder to cry on. Maybe somebody won't have that person to turn to, because you are focused on your pain instead of on your purpose. Now, I'm not here to tell you that it's going to be easy. I'm just telling you that's what we need to do. It's going to be hard. But work your purpose. Find your purpose. And use your purpose. And even in your darkest hours of your trials and tribulations, you'll be able to stand. And not just stand, stand with confidence. Stand with assurity. Stand with hope. And hope is one of the greatest things that we can have. Because when we're in the darkest hours of our life, we've got to hope that tomorrow is going to be better. We got to hope that God's going to show up in the way that we hoping that he's going to show up. We got to hope that the weeping that may endure for a night, we got to hope that that night is coming to an end. That hope propels us forward. Hope should be the thing that's getting you up in the morning. I hope the day is going to be better. I can't promise you that the day going to be better, but that hope ought to get you out of bed. I hope today is going to be better. And even if it's not better, I can still stand. I hope tomorrow is going to bring better days. But even if the day that I'm weeping through doesn't last 24 hours, I can still stand. Because he has instilled in me. And he is allowing this. And if he is allowing this, then he is with me in this. It's just like as parents, there comes a time where we have to step back from our children and let them learn on their own. We give them the information that they need to pass the test, and we have to step back and allow them to learn on their own. God has to step back sometimes, and that's why sometimes we feel like he's not present in what we're going through. He has to step back and allow what he's already put into us to work. It's like Ken used to say, while you're in school and you're going through the preparation for your test, the teacher is teaching you and teaching you and teaching you and giving you lesson plans and giving you study plans. But when it comes time for the test, the teacher is silent. The teacher doesn't say anything. So now it's time for you to take the test. What have you learned from the material that you've been given? And what have you learned from your pain? And this is where the importance of the church and church family comes in. That it's because sometimes I need somebody to come along beside me and remind me that I have the knowledge that I need to survive. Because when the trials and tribulations come at us, sometimes we forget. So I need somebody to come alongside me sometimes and remind me that what I need to survive the storm, God has already put into me. I need somebody to come along and remind me sometimes. If I can't remember myself that God brought me through 5 years ago when I was going through something similar, I need somebody to come along and say, you remember when? Remember when you faced this before and God did this for you. I need that sometimes. That's where the importance of, that's why the Bible tells us not to forsake the assembly of ourselves together, because we need each other. I need somebody to remind me when I forget that God is able. I need somebody to remind me of the miracles. It wouldn't seem like I would need somebody to remind me of a miracle. But when trials and tribulations come at you, it's amazing how distorted your view can get and how much you can forget about the power of God. I need somebody to remind me sometimes you have seen miracles in your life. You have seen God turn some things around in life. I need somebody to remind me of that. What I have learned that keeps me going, my brothers and my sisters, is that God is able. Paul tells us time and time again, he is able to do exceedingly and abundantly above all we ask or think. And if I got somebody like that on my side, who's able to do exceedingly abundantly above even what I can ask or think, then I got some power in my life. And if I can't remember that, y'all please remind me that God is able. Remind me that God is faithful towards his children. Remind me that he is a healer. Remind me that he is a way maker. Remind me that he will keep me in perfect peace if my mind is stayed on him. Remind me of these things. Because these are the things that help us survive. Because in the grand scheme of things, when it's all said and done, and when we sit back and we count the costs and we add it all up, and we're honest with ourselves, as great as our pain has been and as great as our trials have been, as much as our tribulation has affected us, there was always someone standing around us that was going through something worse. that was experiencing the worst hurt and the worst pain. And I'm not saying that to discount what you go through, because whatever's impacting you is important. Even when it feels small to you, even when you don't want to talk about it because you feel like other people got bigger problems, if it's impacting you, it's important. But when we find the faithfulness aspect of it, we begin to realize that God's still been good. I was telling someone just last week, that I often thought about when I lost my mother in 2014. I was in my 30s when I lost her. And I felt like, I didn't get as long with my mother as some people got with their mother. But then I thought about some people never knew their mother. Some people lost their mother way younger than I lost my mother. So I had to thank God for those 30 plus years that he gave me with her. That's when we consider our trials and tribulations. That's what James is talking about. Consider. Think about it. Analyze it. Yes, my situation was painful, but God was still a blessing in my situation. I didn't have her for 50 years. I didn't have her for 60 years. I didn't have her for 75 years. But the 30-something years I had her impacted my life and changed who I am. Made me who I am today. Taught me what love was like. Taught me who Jesus was. So even though I didn't have her as long as I would like to have had her, thank God that I had her. Consider that even though my financial storms have been rough and hard, consider the fact that God, in his faithfulness and his grace and his mercy, he kept a roof over my head. He kept food on my table. He didn't have to do it, but I'm mighty glad that he did. Considering the fact when I was complaining about going to the job that I didn't want to work, that I had a job to go to because somebody didn't. Consider when I'm thinking about the pain that's racking my body and the pinched nerves here and there that I'm dealing with. Consider the fact that I can still walk and talk. We were talking about an old friend this morning. He was a firefighter down in Georgia years ago, and he lost his leg while he was fighting a fire. Had to have his leg amputated above the knee. And he told me, he says, when I would go to the hospital down there for my rehab and everything, he said, I was so down, I was so depressed. I was in my wheelchair and I'm sitting there with my head hung down because I had lost my leg. He said, until somebody rolled in who didn't have no legs. So consider your trials and tribulations. And I guarantee you, if you think about it long enough, you'll find a way that you can count it all joy. If it's nothing but the fact that you survived, you can count it joy. I went through heartache. I went through pain. I had some trials and tribulations, but I'm still standing. I'm still here today. I'm still breathing. I'm still here as a testimony of how good God is. I survived the storm. I survived the night. I survived the pain. I'm still here. And that alone, my brothers and my sisters, is a testimony. The old folks used to say, I got up this morning and I was clothed in my right mind. That's a testimony. I got up this morning and I had the activity of my limbs. That's a testimony. I got up this morning and I had food to eat. That's a testimony. As I laid down to sleep or slumber last night, he didn't allow any hurt, harm, or danger to fall upon me. That's a testimony. I've been through some stuff, but I'm still here. The doors of the church are open.